For over 6 years now, the Fertility Podcast has been sharing content with you, talking about the A to Z of things that might be affecting your fertility.
Gosh, has it really been that long?
I know, time flies, obviously, when you've got lots to say.
And when you're having fun.
It's been a complete whirlwind. We've talked about things from adenomyosis to zero sperm and basically made it our mission to help you find the answers. And as we head into our 7th year, things are changing. You see, the podcast is just a portal into a world of more support, which ultimately is what you need more than ever when you're trying to conceive. So who are we? Well, I'm Natalie Silverman. If you've listened to the podcast, you'll know. I used to be on the radio. I'm also a professional voiceover, so I basically talk a lot for a living. And I launched this podcast after successful fertility treatment. I had my son in 2015, and basically since then, I've not really stopped talking about this topic. And in 2019, I brought in the brilliant Kate Davis into the mix. Kate is a fertility nurse consultant who hates me making her record these intros, don't you, Kate?
Only because I sound so rubbish on them and you sound so cool.
Yeah, but I've just said that this is what I do for a living, so I should at least sound like I know what I'm doing.
Very true.
You know what you're talking about, and you offer amazing clinical support. In terms of what you're seeing day to day, and in the time that you've been in this space as an independent fertility nurse consultant, which is what been about the same time I've been doing the podcast, what would you say is the one thing that people need when it comes to trying to conceive?
Information. They need lots and lots of information and support.
And why are you so into doing it in podcast format?
I think it's great to give information out to people this way because it's so accessible. And we know from talking to our guests that actually they love listening to it in this way because certainly with men, they can listen to it and no one else knows that they're listening to information about fertility. And so I think it's really accessible. And what I love about a podcast, listening to ours and listening to others, is that you can do it in what I call dead time. It's that time when you're in the car, when you're going on a dog walk, when you're commuting. It's just great time to sit and listen and enjoy whatever it is that you're interested in.
Now, part of what is changing with the podcast is that Kate and I are offering even more support. And it was really Kate and what she does that gave me the kick up the bum to complete my studies, because I'm now a qualified Freedom Fertility Formula Specialist, which means I'm working more closely with you to help you with your emotional well-being. And together, what Kate and I are doing is offering an amazing support network along with the content that we're sharing on this podcast. And so what we want to do is offer you the chance to be a patron of this podcast. Now, if you've listened to podcasts you may have heard Patreon talks about before, it's a brilliant way for people like you to support people like us in what we do.
So what does all of this mean? Basically, you're going to get shout outs on the podcast and your name, if you want it, or it can be your social media handle, will be on the Fertility Podcast website. We're going to be having some awesome monthly get-togethers and we're going to take the time to answer your questions and bring in some fab speakers. And if there's someone you've been really wanting to hear from, you can have a say on who we interview going forward, as we'll be running polls for you to vote on. If that's not enough to get you interested, you'll get early access to our episodes a week ahead of their release. Plus, there's going to be other really useful resources too. So does this sound good?
You know it sounds good. So what you need to do is get on the case and join us today. It's very simple. Just go to patreon.com/the Fertility Podcast. Now, as you know, the Fertility Podcast is all about empowering you in the next steps in your fertility journey. We're always delighted to find people who are on the same mission as we are. So we give a massive welcome to Merck, a new sponsor of the Fertility Podcast. They are a leading science and technology company with a rich history in the area of fertility. And with this experience, Merck has launched Bloom, a brand new website intending to provide you with information, whether you're looking to start your family or grow it and you need some help on what you're going to do next. So to find out more, just visit merckbloom.com. So Kate and I have had a little break from the podcast and we were hoping we might go to see one another, but we haven't because lockdown, especially where I live in Manchester, hasn't eased. And so we haven't been able to meet up. So we're still remote, which is sad, isn't it?
It is sad. It is sad, but I was looking forward to chatting today. It was quite nice to get the mic out, dust the mic off and dust the headphones off again.
Blow away the cobwebs. Because having had a little break from the podcast, we are coming back with a series talking about the early years, because the Fertility Podcast is entering its 7th year. There's a ton of podcasts available now. We've talked about so many different things. And what we wanted to do was, I suppose, highlight all the stuff that we could have known. If only we'd known, then maybe some of the stuff that we find ourselves learning about once we're trying to conceive, well, it wouldn't be so new and so daunting, would it, if we were a bit better informed? And I know, Kate, that this is a big passion of yours because you've done quite a lot of fertility education work, haven't you?
I have, in schools and in colleges over the years. And when I look at these students and pupils and I think, oh, if only, I'd had the opportunity to have this information at their age, it would have demystified so much. Because I think it's quite scary, isn't it, when you start as a teenager kind of coming into all these changes and everything that's going on, and you don't really know a great deal about them. But then certainly I then see on the other side of the coin, women and men, who are trying to conceive later on in life that perhaps would have really benefited from having that education at an earlier point in their life.
Because everybody that I'm now talking to in terms of the messages and stuff that they hold kind of quite deep rooted about their fertility, we were all told, especially as women, about not getting pregnant at school. It was kind of drummed into us that you mustn't get pregnant and what you needed to do in order to not get pregnant, rather than actually having it explained in terms of our fertile health. We had the biology bit, so we knew the kind of bits that we had, but I don't think it was really as clearly explained as we really need it to be.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think whilst we had the biology, I don't think we really had the understanding of the menstrual cycle and exactly what happens and when and why and what that means for your fertility, and how actually when you do try to conceive, it's just such a finite time that you've got to be able to conceive naturally. And if only we had that information, I think we'd be a lot better prepared, don't you?
Yeah. Totally. Well, especially now as I'm having like the same kind of conversations about what we didn't know. And if you're on any kind of social media forums, if you're in Facebook groups, or even if you're on Instagram, you'll probably have seen these kind of conversations and these questions. And one of the things that is still kind of dumbfounding a lot of people is tracking their cycle. And we know now we're in an age where there's loads of apps and there's all sorts of things that you can do. But I know it's something, again, that you're really keen to help people demystify, aren't you?
Yes, I'm really passionate about it. There's a lot of evidence suggests that having fertility awareness knowledge reduces your time to conception considerably. But we're really bad at giving that information. If a woman's trying to conceive, she might go to a doctor and perhaps she's been trying for a year or 6 months and will be told to go away and keep trying, but not given that vital information that can make the difference.
And what's the vital information, would you say?
So there are 3 fertility indicators that you can observe throughout your cycle, and these change. So one is temperature, one is cervical mucus, and one is the changes in your cervix. And these, I think, are amazing. This is lovely information that Mother Nature has given us that tells you so much about when you're fertile and that finite fertile window. And so if you observe these indicators, you can gather so much information about your cycle, and it's really, really empowering.
I know that we've kind of touched on this before in terms of just getting more awareness and kind of logging it down. And we talked about apps in the past. Do you think it's better, or it gets a bit overwhelming if people are using apps, or do you think it's better that they use like a notebook? What do you suggest?
I think it depends on what you're choosing, because there are so many different types of apps or monitors. So you can go from the very basic, and the very basic would be like a calendar app, which does no more than actually writing in a diary. So it's not giving you any more information. Then you can move on to something that actually does use some physiological information like temperature, and that can give you a little bit more guidance. And then obviously the monitors and the sensors give you an awful lot more. The only issue with some of the apps that claim to be able to identify your fertile window is that sometimes the algorithms that they use aren't sophisticated enough to be able to really give you that guidance. So I always say choose the right thing for you and what your needs are, and be careful in your choices.
Because one of the things that I talk a lot about in the coaching work that I do is I get people to think about the things that they've been doing whilst they've been trying to conceive, and the things that feel good and the things that don't feel good. And all too often people talk about when they're like using the ovulation sticks or they're tracking their temperature, and that it causes quite a lot of stress. What would you say if people are like going, no, me? Because it does seem to be quite a common one that people find it more stress than it's worth.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think obviously if it's causing any stress, then stop. There's absolutely no point in adding any more stress into your fertility journey. Interestingly, what I often see is that women also find it quite reassuring. So particularly if they're learning and they've learned how to use this information correctly, perhaps just not following an app, but they're actually have been taught how to use it correctly, then they can find it really reassuring, particularly for women that, don't know if they're ovulating or when they're ovulating. Having that knowledge is incredibly empowering. So I think there's two sides of the coin, but if you definitely find it stressful, don't do it. If you find it's useful for you, excellent.
So if you're talking in terms of just starting to try to have a baby, because the whole series that we're looking to share is the early years, and you've got no idea of your period or anything, is it as basic as just starting to note down your dates?
That's a really good start, yeah. So by writing down when your last period was on a calendar and working out how long your cycle is. So the first day of your cycle is the first day of your period, and the last day of your cycle is the day before your next period. So even that information, you can determine whether or not you're having normal length cycles, which go from about 21, 25 to up to 35 days in length, or whether you're having really short cycles or long cycles. And that can often give you quite a lot of information. And it's great information to take to your doctor or your specialist and say, this is what's happening with my cycle.
Do you think all too often people assume that they've got a kind of 28-day cycle?
Oh, yes. Do you know what? This is my pet hate. And this is because this is what we're taught at school, that your cycle is 28 days and you ovulate on day 14. I look at cycles day in, day out. It's my bread and butter. And rarely do I see a woman that has consistently a 28-day cycle and equally consistently ovulates on day 14. It moves around, and that's normal and quite healthy. But we do need to get away from this, perpetuating this myth of a 28-day cycle and ovulation on day 14.
And so from the conversations that you have with the ladies that you're talking to, if they are going and speaking with their GPs, is there still that assumption in the GP practice that it's a 28-day cycle, or is that knowledge filtering through at those early conversations that people might be having?
I think there is still that assumption, yes, definitely. And a really good example of that is the day 21 progesterone test, which any listeners will know that if you're needing to confirm ovulation, you will have a day 21 progesterone test. And unfortunately, it's called day 21 because it's accurate if taken on day 21 of a 28-day cycle. But if your cycle is shorter or longer, then it's inaccurate. And therefore, that could be quite devastating because it can give you the diagnosis that you're not ovulating. But actually, you just haven't ovulated yet because your cycle is longer, or you ovulated way before and therefore it's not picking it up. So yes, unfortunately that myth of the 28-day cycle does still exist, and like I said, we need to get away from it.
So this is a bit of a starting point for ladies to think about. When it comes to guys, and we're talking about the early days of basically trying to conceive, I mean, we've talked a lot on the Fertility Podcast before about things to be aware of in terms of kind of sperm health and general fertility health. But if it's younger guys, what would your starting point be? Would it be the kind of protein shakes in the gym as a first start?
Yeah, again, that's my other real pet hate. I have 2 teenage boys. They don't take protein shakes, but I know a lot of their friends are. And this is a really worrying thing because what we're seeing is a correlation with protein shake use and poor sperm parameters. So if you think we've got a generation growing up that are going to the gym, they're pumping the iron, they're taking these protein shakes because they want to look good for women. But actually what they're ending up doing is reducing their sperm count and shrinking their testicles. Now, how farcical is that? It's crazy.
Yeah.
But I think general lifestyle for men and women in the early years is so important. So, thinking about your alcohol consumption. I know that's difficult when you're out partying and that's kind of what you want to do, and you absolutely should enjoy your life, but it's just having that sense check every now and again, thinking about smoking, thinking about recreational drugs, and importantly, thinking about sexually transmitted infections as well.
Well, we're going to have an episode talking more about those STIs in this series about the early years. What about the pill, though? If people are listening and they are not really thinking about starting a family yet, but they're on the pill. And I mean, I was listening to a conversation recently where a lady was taking the pill back to back, and she was kind of under the assumption that it would be the best way for her to manage things and definitely not get pregnant. But if you're doing something like that and you're taking it back to back for a period of time, and then you decide you want to start trying, is there any downsides to using contraception like that?
I think it's really important to get this in perspective. When you're not wanting to conceive, and maybe when you're in your 20s or even in your early 30s, and actually having a pregnancy would be devastating, then contraception is absolutely what you need. You need a good, reliable contraception. And there is no evidence to suggest that using contraception affects your fertility. So if you're not there yet and wanting to conceive, then absolutely. Backing your pills back to back, actually, it's not so much of a problem. You can definitely do that for 3 cycles and then have a break. And then if you think about other methods of contraception where you don't have periods at all, like the implant and injection, again, that's okay not to have a period. So I think it's important to not be frightened of contraception because it's needed. And then eventually, when you do want to start conceiving, maybe come off it a little bit earlier, a few months before, and then you can get your body into really good health before you start actively trying to conceive.
And the other thing, we've shared conversations about tests that you can do to kind of check your fertile health, your certain levels. We've spoken with likes of Modern Fertility in the past. We've spoken with MediChecks, who more recently have started home testing for you to learn about your fertile health. And there's tests for men as well. And so if we're talking about a younger audience who are maybe just keen to know their options, would you say that early testing is empowering, or is it going to just scare them?
I think it's actually empowering, and I'm seeing an increase in that, actually, that we're becoming more aware and more aware of our health as a nation, and that can only be a good thing. I think the important thing is if you're going to have some home testing and then you're not sure on the result, make sure you get advice from your doctor. Most of the organisations that offer home testing will have a facility where you actually get a report from a doctor anyway, so you're getting really good, accurate information. But I think it's absolutely fine if you want to be curious about your health and find this information out, go for it. But just make sure you've got the support from a professional when you've got your result.
And the other thing that I've not really asked you your thoughts on, Kate, and I've talked about it on the podcast, don't be worried. But I was talking with somebody the other day about it, and it's about egg freezing. It's about if you're younger, if you're in your early 20s, or even, mid to late 20s, or even early 30s. But we're talking really about in your 20s as the kind of optimal time, if egg freezing is something that you've maybe heard about. What do you think about it, Kate? Because I was talking to someone the other day and I was saying that I think it's a really, again, empowering thing for women to know about, to have the option of doing. And we had a great chat with Abby, who was a 25-year-old who was diagnosed with breast cancer and was able to freeze her eggs. And she talked about how unobtrusive the procedure was when she thought that it would be much more intrusive than she expected. And I was telling somebody about that recently because they were under the assumption that it was a very invasive procedure and that people were kind of being sold into it without really having all the information. Whereas I don't quite agree with that. I think it's a really interesting option to know about and to think about.
Well, I'm all for choice, and I think offering women choice is vitally important. I think there are some things that are important to consider, primarily the fact that although the freezing process has got a lot better, it still isn't 100%. So you could decide to freeze your eggs, but actually then when you wanted to come to use them, not have that reassurance. I think also it's really important that women don't definitely see that as a definite reassurance for the fact that I've said that actually it may not be what you want at the end of it. And therefore, once you decide to have a child, that you kind of go for it and don't delay, especially with age is not on your side. So whilst I think it's an excellent opportunity and it presents a great choice for women, I think it does come with some real considerations too. And I'm not saying that it shouldn't be offered. Absolutely, it should. But if you find the right man and the time is right, just go for it.
What we just want to make sure is that you know all your options. That's been the whole kind of point of the Fertility Podcast in all the time that we've been making this content. And If this kind of conversation is something that you've got more questions bubbling away, then what you definitely need to do is become a patron of the Fertility Podcast, which is a new thing that we've started with this new series that we've kind of come back after a little break. And all you need to do is go to patreon.com/the Fertility Podcast. And basically, Kate and I are going to be there once a month answering your questions. We're going to be doing more guest interviews, but we're also going to be sharing other content, and there'll be archived episodes because we've got so many now that we've had to put some on the Patreon site because there's just too many to have on the podcast. We've got nearly 300 episodes.
Wow.
So exactly, it's ridiculous, but it's great. But it just shows how many questions and how many topics that, there are when we're talking about this stuff. Do you think that there is enough conversations about the early years? Like, we're going to be talking in an upcoming episode to one of the founders of We Are the Hood, which I know you were really keen to talk to them about that. Do you want to just explain a little bit about it and what you feel about the narrative around this kind of early fertility education?
I think it's something that we are starting to talk about more. If you look at, so for example, the Netherlands have been always very pro talking about fertility and sex to even a young age group. And they've always had the lowest teenage pregnancy rate ever in the whole of Europe because they're so open.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly, our teenage pregnancy rate has dropped for the first time ever, which is so interesting. I don't think it's necessarily because we're talking about it more. I think there are other factors in play there. But I definitely think there is more information out there. And We Are the Hood are a great example of where they're promoting talking about fertility, promoting talking about menstruation, promoting talking about women's health from a young age and then going through the age span. So they're following a woman's lifespan, which is just fantastic because it means that they've created this amazing journal, which is beautiful.
And it celebrates it, doesn't it?
It really does celebrate it. Have you ever read The Red Tent, Natalie?
Yes, I have. It's a great book.
It's a great book. And that book really celebrates women and menstruation, doesn't it? But it talks very much originally about how women are segregated into this tent. But actually, while they're in this tent, they develop this amazing sisterhood. And it's one of my favourite books, actually. But yeah, I think we definitely are beginning to talk about it more. But that's not to say we've got a long, long way to go.
I'm just curious as to you hinted at the reasons why teenage pregnancies may have dropped in this country. Why do you think? I think obviously we're in lockdown, so that's how current you're talking.
This was actually 2018 statistics, I believe. So quite a long time ago, way before COVID. I think our society has changed and women are doing a lot more in education. They're doing a lot more in their careers. And so I think what initially probably started off at the top level where women were getting pregnant later, younger women are seeing that and actually seeing that there's more to life that they want to experience rather than necessarily getting pregnant and settling down, which can only be a good thing.
Definitely. Well, as I said before, this is just the start of lots of conversations that we'll be having more of if you become a patron. So just that website again, patreon.com/the Fertility Podcast. You can join us and be part of our gang and you'll be celebrated on the Fertility Podcast website, either with your name or your social media handle, whichever you prefer. You'll get shout outs in the podcast and it just means we can all get to know each other better.
Yay.
And you'll get more of Kate's wisdom because she's so good at this stuff. She's done all of that unprompted. She didn't even know the questions I was going to ask her.
Yeah, but also we get your amazing support as well now that you're newly qualified and doing an excellent job. So yeah, what's there not to love about all of this, hey?
We hope you enjoyed the show. All the info of our guests will be just below this episode in whichever podcast app you're listening in.
And remember, if you do just one new thing today to help you get even more support on your fertility journey, why not become a Patreon of the podcast? Just visit patreon.com/the Fertility Podcast.